There's a special ache that comes with watching your dreams grow old alongside you, settling into the quiet corners of a heart that once believed anything was possible. For 3 long years, 73-year-old Vivian Porter has convinced herself that chapter of her life closed with her husband's final breath. In the Montana Territory of 1885, she tends her small homestead alone, her days filled with garden work and feeding chickens. When Roman Fletcher, a weathered mountain man, appears at her door seeking water and food, she offers him a simple meal. "I am too old to love, sir," she tells him plainly, "but I can cook." Yet as he keeps returning with small repairs and gentle conversation, something unexpected begins to stir between them. Can two people who thought their time for love had passed discover that the heart keeps its own calendar? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the valley where Vivian Porter had made her home for nearly 5 decades. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the light creep across the vegetable garden she'd tended with the same careful attention her mother had taught her back in Ohio. The hand-carved wooden spoon her husband had made during their first winter together rested in her palm, smooth from years of stirring, seasoning, and serving meals that had nourished a family, welcomed neighbors, and comforted the grieving. At 73, Vivian's hands bore the honest marks of a life well lived. Calluses from garden tools, tiny scars from rose thorns, and the deep lines that came from kneading bread every Saturday for 47 years. Her silver hair, still thick and often braided down her back, caught the morning light as she moved through her daily routine with the precision of someone who had learned to find purpose in small rituals. The cabin around her told the story of their life together. Every log had been cut, shaped, and fitted by her husband's patient hands. The stone fireplace still held the soot from countless winter evenings when they'd sat together, him reading aloud from whatever book the circuit preacher had brought, her mending clothes or working on quilts. The wide plank floors bore the gentle wear of decades, smooth paths between kitchen and sitting room, bedroom and front door, marking the geography of their shared existence. Outside, the homestead stretched across 23 acres of high prairie, bordered by aspen groves that turned gold each autumn, and a creek that ran clear and cold, even in the driest summers. They'd chosen this spot not just for the water, but for the view, rolling hills that seemed to go on forever, changing color with the seasons and the movement of clouds. "A man needs something beautiful to look at while he's working," her husband had said, and she'd agreed, though she'd been thinking of the practical considerations: good drainage, protection from the worst winds, and soil that would grow more than sagebrush and disappointment. The vegetable garden occupied the sunny southeast corner of their property, protected by a fence her husband had built to keep out deer and rabbits. Neat rows of potatoes, beans, squash, and corn marched across the fertile ground she'd enriched with years of composting and careful cultivation. A smaller plot held her herbs: sage, thyme, rosemary, and the mint that threatened to take over everything if she didn't keep it contained. The chicken coop, painted red like the barn her husband had never quite finished, housed a dozen hens that provided eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. Every morning began the same way: coffee first, strong and black, brewed in the blue enamel pot that had been a wedding gift from her aunt. While it percolated, she'd step outside to check the weather and breathe in the sweet mountain air. The chickens would fuss and cluck, demanding their breakfast with the entitled attitude of creatures who knew their worth. She'd scatter feed and gather eggs, pausing to appreciate the perfect architecture of each shell, the way the morning light made them glow like treasures in her basket. Breakfast was simple: eggs scrambled with herbs from her garden, thick slices of bread from the loaves she baked twice weekly, and honey from the beehives her neighbor tended. She ate slowly, savoring flavors and the quiet company of her own thoughts. The silence that had once felt oppressive now brought a different kind of peace. She'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, though some mornings the distinction felt thinner than others. After breakfast came the endless round of tasks that kept a homestead running: weeding the garden, tending the animals, preserving food for winter, mending whatever needed mending. Her hands stayed busy even when her heart felt hollow. She'd discovered that grief was not a destination, but a traveling companion, sometimes quiet in the background, sometimes demanding attention with unexpected intensity. The community of Pine Ridge, such as it was, consisted of perhaps 30 families scattered across the valley and surrounding hills. Once a month, weather permitting, they gathered for worship in the schoolhouse that doubled as their church. The circuit preacher, a young man with kind eyes and a tendency toward lengthy sermons, would arrive on horseback with news from other settlements and a bag of books for anyone interested in borrowing. Vivian had watched this community grow from a handful of desperate families to something approaching a real settlement. She'd helped birth babies, laid out the dead, nursed the sick through fevers and broken bones, and fed anyone who showed up at her door hungry. Her reputation as a cook had spread far enough that traveling salesmen and government officials sometimes made detours to her table. She took quiet pride in this, understanding that hospitality was both gift and responsibility. The neighbors closest to her were the Caldwells, a young family with 3 children under 10. Mary Caldwell often stopped by for advice about everything from treating croup to canning vegetables. Vivian enjoyed these visits, remembering her own early years of marriage when everything felt like a crisis, requiring immediate resolution. The children called her Aunt Vivian and treated her homestead like an extension of their own, which pleased her more than she let on. On Sundays, after the worship service, the women would gather to share news and concerns. Vivian found herself cast in the role of elder stateswoman, sought out for wisdom about everything from difficult husbands to failing crops. She offered what help she could, though she sometimes wondered what qualified her to advise others on matters she'd barely managed herself. The men talked of weather and politics, cattle prices, and the possibility of a railroad spur that might connect them to the wider world. Vivian listened to their conversations with half an ear, more interested in the children playing and the subtle negotiations between wives about who would host the next gathering. Her own marriage had been remarkably free of drama. She'd married David Porter at 19, fresh from Ohio and eager for adventure. He'd been 32, a former soldier with gentle hands and patient ways, looking for a wife to help him build something permanent. They'd suited each other well, both practical, both hard-working, both content with simple pleasures and honest labor. The children they'd hoped for never came, though not for lack of trying or wanting. They'd grieved that loss privately, finding ways to channel their nurturing instincts into caring for their community and each other. David had taught her to read the weather, to judge the health of livestock, to repair harness and sharpen tools. She'd taught him to cook more than beans and bacon, to appreciate the way flowers could brighten even the humblest room, to find joy in small daily rituals. Their conversations had been comfortable, ranging from practical matters to shared dreams. They'd planned the orchard they never planted, the trips they never took, the improvements they never quite got around to making. But the life they built together had been rich in its own way, filled with quiet satisfactions and the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. David's death had been, mercifully quick, a heart attack while repairing the barn roof on a warm spring morning 3 years ago. She'd found him there when he didn't come in for lunch, looking almost peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. The community had rallied around her with typical frontier generosity, but the overwhelming silence afterward had been harder to bear than the initial shock of loss. She'd considered selling the homestead and moving to town, maybe even back to Ohio where her sister still lived. But walking away from everything they'd built together felt like abandoning David all over again. So she'd stayed, learning to manage alone what had always been shared work. Some tasks she'd adapted, others she'd simply eliminated. The barn still needed finishing, but it would have to wait for someone else's hands. The evenings were the hardest time, when the day's work was done and the long twilight stretched ahead. She'd taken to sitting on the front porch with her mending, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to the night sounds beginning. Owls calling, coyotes singing, the rustle of small creatures in the grass. Sometimes she talked to David, telling him about her day or asking his opinion on decisions that needed making. She wasn't sure she believed he could hear her, but the conversations brought comfort nonetheless. As autumn approached this year, Vivian found herself thinking more about the future. Winter was always a test of preparation and endurance, but this would be her fourth winter alone. She'd proven she could survive, but survival and living weren't the same thing. Lately, she'd begun to wonder if mere survival was enough, or if there might be something more waiting for her in whatever years remained. The morning routine continued as always. Coffee, eggs, the endless cycle of tasks that marked her days. But today felt different somehow, charged with the kind of anticipation that comes before weather changes. She couldn't have said why, but as she scattered feed for the chickens and gathered their warm eggs, Vivian Porter found herself looking toward the mountains with an expectation she hadn't felt in years. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning when the August heat shimmered across the prairie like water, distorting the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Vivian was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she noticed the figure moving slowly down the slope from the high ridge, leading what looked like a pack mule. At first, she mistook him for a shadow cast by the clouds, but as he drew closer, she could make out the reality of him. A man walking with the careful gait of someone who'd traveled far and wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. She folded the sheet she'd been hanging and moved to where she could see him better without appearing to stare. Frontier courtesy demanded hospitality, but frontier wisdom counseled caution with strangers. This man looked like he'd been living rough for some time. His clothes were well made but weathered, his boots worn thin, and his hair hung past his shoulders in tangles that spoke of months without proper grooming. A full beard covered most of his face, streaked with grey that caught the morning light. What struck her most were his eyes, pale blue and careful, scanning her homestead with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. When he spotted her watching from beside the chicken coop, he stopped and raised one hand in greeting, making no move to come closer without invitation. "Mom," he called across the yard, his voice carrying a roughness that suggested disuse. "Wonder if I might trouble you for some water. Been walking since before dawn, and my supplies are running low." Vivian studied him for a long moment. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 50 or so, and despite his unkempt appearance, something in his manner spoke of education and good breeding. His pack mule stood patiently behind him, loaded with worn leather saddlebags that had seen better days but showed careful maintenance. A man's whole life could fit in bags like those, she realized. Everything he owned, everything he was, reduced to what he could carry. "Water's free," she replied, pointing toward the well. "Help yourself." He nodded his thanks and approached slowly, still careful not to presume too much. At the well, he drew water first for his mule, then filled a battered tin cup for himself. He drank deeply, then cupped water in his palms to splash his face and neck. When he straightened, she could see him more clearly. Weathered features that might have been handsome once, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunrises, and hands that knew hard work. "Name's Roman Fletcher," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "I'm grateful for your kindness." "Vivian Porter," she replied. "You travelin' far?" "Been up in the high country most of the summer. Thought it might be time to see what's become of civilization." His smile was tentative, as if he wasn't sure he remembered how to use it. "Haven't had a proper conversation with another human being in near 3 months." The admission touched something in her chest. Recognition, perhaps, of what isolation could do to a person. She'd had 3 years to learn the weight of silence, the way it could settle into your bones and make you forget how to reach across the space between yourself and others. "You look like you could use a proper meal," she heard herself saying. "I was just about to start lunch." He blinked, clearly surprised by the invitation. "That's generous of you, Mom, but I don't want to impose." "No imposition. I always make too much anyway." This wasn't entirely true, but the lie came easily. "You can tend your mule in the shade by the barn while I get something together." Roman Fletcher stood very still for a moment, as if her offer might evaporate if he moved too quickly. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "That's very kind. I'd be happy to work for the meal, split some wood, repair something that needs fixing." "We'll see," Vivian said, already turning toward the house. "Get yourself settled first." In her kitchen, she moved with purpose born of decades of feeding unexpected visitors. Leftover chicken from Sunday's dinner, fresh bread baked yesterday morning, green beans from the garden, and a jar of the peach preserves she'd put up in July. Simple food, but honest and filling. She found herself taking extra care with the presentation, using her good plates instead of the everyday ones, adding a small pitcher of cream for the coffee. When she called him in 20 minutes later, Roman had indeed found shade for his mule and was sitting quietly on the front steps, hands folded and patient as a man accustomed to waiting. He'd made some attempt to tame his hair and beard, and she could see he'd brushed the worst of the trail dust from his clothes. "Smells wonderful," he said, following her into the cabin. His eyes took in the neat interior with obvious appreciation, the polished wood, the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, the small touches that made a house a home. "You have a beautiful place here." "Built it with my husband," she said, setting the food on the table. "He passed 3 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." The words carried genuine sympathy, not the automatic condolence most people offered. A man would have to be proud, building something like this. They sat across from each other at the table that had hosted countless meals, countless conversations. Roman ate with obvious hunger, but good manners, complimenting the food without overdoing it. Between bites, he answered her careful questions about where he'd come from and where he was heading. "Used to have a small ranch up near Helena," he said. "Sold it a few years back and took to the mountains. Sometimes a man needs to get away from things for a while, think about what matters." "And have you figured that out?" He considered the question seriously, cutting another piece of chicken with precise movements. "Some. Still working on the rest, I suppose." "What brought you down from the high country? Winter's coming. Even up there you can feel it in the air." And I got to thinking maybe I'd spent enough time alone with my thoughts. He looked up from his plate, meeting her eyes directly. "Sometimes solitude stops being healing and starts being hiding." The observation settled between them like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples neither had expected. Vivian found herself studying his face, trying to read the story. Written in the lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words. "I appreciate the meal more than I can say," Roman continued. "Been living on beans and hardtack for longer than's good for a man's soul." "Food's meant to be shared," she replied, though even as she said it, she wondered when she'd last believed that herself. These days, she ate most of her meals in solitude, going through the motions of cooking out of habit rather than joy. When the meal was finished, Roman insisted on helping with the dishes despite her protests. He worked carefully, obviously unaccustomed to kitchen tasks, but willing to learn. She found herself noticing small things, the way he handled her good china with reverence, the way he listened when she explained where things belonged. "I noticed your fence has a section that's coming loose," he said as they finished. "Posts rotted through at the base. I could fix that for you if you'd like. Fair trade for the meal." "That's not necessary." "It is to me," he said quietly. "I don't take charity well, ma'am. Never have. But I can work for what I receive, and that sits better with both of us, I think." She studied his face, seeing pride there and something else, a need to be useful, to matter in some small way. "All right. There are tools in the barn, and I think there might be a spare post somewhere. I'll take care of it this afternoon, then be on my way come morning. Unless—" he paused, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Would it be too much presumption to ask if I might sleep in your barn tonight? I'll be gone before you're up, and I won't be any trouble." "The barn's fine," she said. "There's hay enough to make a decent bed." As Roman headed outside to begin work on the fence, Vivian found herself watching from the kitchen window. His movements were economical and sure, the actions of a man comfortable with tools and physical labor. She'd almost forgotten what it looked like to have someone else working around the homestead, taking care of the endless tasks that needed doing. Something had shifted during their shared meal, though she couldn't quite name what. For the first time in 3 years, her cabin didn't feel quite so empty, her silence quite so complete. And when she tried to imagine tomorrow morning with Roman, Fletcher gone, continuing down whatever road called to him, the prospect left her feeling oddly bereft. "I am too old to love, sir," she whispered to herself, testing the words she'd never spoken aloud. "But I can cook." Even as she said them, she wondered why the thought had occurred to her at all. Roman Fletcher returned on Friday morning, 3 days after he'd disappeared over the eastern ridge, with a polite tip of his hat, and what she'd assumed was a final farewell. Vivian was in her garden, pulling weeds from the bean rows, when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats and the soft jingle of tack. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and saw him approaching with his pack mule and something else, a travois loaded with lumber. "Morning, Mrs. Porter," he called, stopping at the edge of her property line with the same careful courtesy he'd shown before. "I brought materials for that fence repair, if the offer still stands." The broken fence post had been leaning at an increasingly precarious angle since a spring storm had weakened its foundation. She'd propped it up with stones and wire, but the temporary fix wouldn't survive the first hard wind of autumn. It was exactly the kind of task that felt manageable until you actually tried to do it alone, digging out the old post, setting a new one, restringing the wire at proper tension. "Where did you get the lumber?" she asked, approaching him with dirt still clinging to her gardening gloves. "Mill owner in Pine Ridge owed me a favor from last winter. I did some work for him during the cold months." Roman dismounted and began unloading the travois with practiced efficiency. "Nothing fancy, but it'll hold." She watched him work, noting the quality of the wood he'd brought, not scraps or seconds, but good, straight pine that would last for years. The kind of lumber that cost real money, not the sort of thing a drifting mountain man would typically invest in for a stranger's fence. "This is too much," she said. "I can't accept already bought and paid for," he replied, without looking up from his unpacking. "Can't very well return it now." The lie was obvious but kindly meant. She recognized the careful pride of a man who wanted to help without making her feel obligated or diminished. It was the same pride that had driven David to spend his last dollar on seed corn during their lean early years, trusting that generosity would somehow find its way back to them. "Well then," she said finally, "I suppose I'd better put some coffee on." Roman's smile transformed his weathered features, making him look younger and less careworn. "That would be much appreciated." She left him setting up his tools and went inside to start the coffee and consider what else she might offer. The morning's baking had produced a loaf of cinnamon bread that was still cooling on the windowsill, and there were eggs enough for a substantial breakfast. Before she could question her motivations too closely, she found herself setting the table for two and pulling out the good jam she usually saved for company. The work began with Roman digging out the rotted post, a task that required more effort than anticipated. The root system had grown deep over the years, and the surrounding soil had settled into stubborn clay. Vivian found herself lingering near the kitchen window, ostensibly busy with indoor tasks, but actually watching him work. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to physical labor, pausing occasionally to wipe sweat from his forehead or assess his progress. There was something deeply satisfying about watching competent hands tackle a job that needed doing. She'd almost forgotten the pleasure of shared purpose. The way work became lighter when distributed between willing partners. When she brought him coffee and a thick slice of bread at mid-morning, Roman was waist-deep in the hole he'd dug, his shirt discarded in the growing heat. She tried not to notice the play of muscles across his shoulders or the careful way he accepted the refreshment, as if small kindnesses still surprised him. "Used to do this kind of work regular," he said, settling back on his heels to enjoy the break. Forgotten how good it feels to fix something that's broken. What kind of work? She asked, genuinely curious about his past. Bit of everything. Ranching mostly, but I did some construction when times were lean. Built barns, houses, whatever folks needed. He gestured toward her cabin with obvious appreciation. Your husband knew his craft. This place is built to last. He was a patient teacher. Made sure I understood how things worked in case something happened to him. The memory carried less pain than it once had, she noticed. Time had softened the sharp edges of grief into something more like gentle melancholy. Smart man. Woman living alone needs to understand her property. They talked easily while he worked. Their conversation ranging from practical matters, the best way to preserve meat for winter, whether the coming season would bring early snow, to more personal topics. Roman spoke carefully about his years in the mountains, describing the wildlife he'd observed and the changing patterns of weather without revealing much about why he'd chosen such isolation. Vivian found herself sharing stories about the early days of the settlement, the characters who'd come and gone, the small dramas that seemed monumental when you were living through them. She surprised herself by laughing at memories she hadn't visited in years. The time their neighbor's prize rooster had terrorized the circuit preacher. The winter when everyone in Pine Ridge had come down with the same mysterious ailment that turned out to be caused by bad flour from a traveling merchant. By lunchtime, Roman had the old post out and the hole prepared for its replacement. They ate at her kitchen table again, but the meal felt different than their first shared food. Less cautious, more companionable. He complimented her cooking with genuine enthusiasm, and she found herself taking extra pleasure in his appreciation. This is the finest cornbread I've had in years, he said, reaching for a second piece. My late wife used to make something similar, but I never could get the recipe right. It was the first time he'd mentioned a wife, and Vivian felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy. She's been gone long? Near 10 years now. Consumption took her along with our daughter. His voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully controlled but never fully healed. After that, I found it hard to stay in places that held so many memories. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it. I can understand why you'd need to get away. Can you? Most folks think running away from pain just makes it worse. Maybe it does for some people. But sometimes you need distance to figure out how to carry it properly. She paused, considering her own experience. I thought about leaving after David died. Seemed like everything here was just a reminder of what I'd lost. What changed your mind? Realized the reminders were also what I had left of him. Seemed wasteful to throw that away because it hurt. Roman nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts about loss and healing, and the unexpected ways people found to go on living. When he returned to work on the fence, Vivian didn't retreat to the house as she normally would have. Instead, she found tasks that kept her nearby, hanging laundry, weeding the herb garden, mending a section of chicken wire that had been on her mental list for weeks. They worked within sight of each other, occasionally exchanging comments or observations, settling into an easy rhythm of shared industry. As the afternoon wore on, she realized how much she'd missed this, not just the help with difficult tasks, but the simple presence of another person going about the business of making things better. The homestead felt more alive somehow, more purposeful, with Roman's quiet competence filling the spaces that had grown too familiar in their emptiness. Roman's visits fell into a pattern as natural as the changing seasons. Every Tuesday and Friday, he appeared with his pack mule and whatever materials or tools the next project required. Vivian found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that surprised her, planning meals around his expected arrival and making mental notes of tasks that might benefit from his skilled hands. Her recipe box, a wedding gift from her mother that she'd treasured for decades, became a source of renewed joy. The wooden container held cards yellowed with age, each one recording not just ingredients and instructions, but memories of occasions when the food had mattered. David's favorite molasses cookies, the spice cake she'd made for every church social, the beef stew that had sustained them through their hardest winter. Now she found herself pulling out recipes she hadn't used in years, wanting to share these pieces of her history with someone who would appreciate them properly. "You're spoiling me, Mrs. Porter," Roman said on a particularly warm Tuesday, settling into what had become his customary chair at her kitchen table. She'd prepared chicken and dumplings from her grandmother's recipe, the kind of meal that required patience and timing and filled the whole house with the smell of comfort. "Vivian," she corrected gently, as she had several times before. "And I enjoy cooking for someone who appreciates it. Gets tiresome, making meals just for yourself." "Vivian, then." He tried the name carefully as if testing its weight on his tongue. "This is restaurant-quality food. You ever think about opening a place in town?" She laughed at the suggestion. "At my age? Besides, cooking for strangers isn't the same as cooking for people you care about." The words slipped out before she could catch them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Roman paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth, but his expression remained kind, understanding. "I'm grateful to be counted among people you care about," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since anyone took that kind of trouble for me." Their conversations had deepened along with their friendship. Roman gradually revealed more about his past, his service in the war, the small ranch he'd built with his wife, the daughter who'd been the light of both their lives. He spoke of them with reverence, but without the raw pain that had initially shadowed his references to loss. "Annie was just 7 when she got sick," he said one afternoon, repairing a section of Vivian's chicken coop that had been damaged by a summer storm. Bright as a new penny, always asking questions about everything. Sarah used to say she'd be a teacher someday, with all her curiosity about the world. Vivian handed him another nail, her heart aching for the life he'd lost. 7's such a sweet age, old enough to have real conversations, young enough to still believe in magic. That's exactly right. She'd follow me around the ranch, wanting to help with everything. Mostly she just got in the way, but I never minded. Now I'd give anything to have her underfoot again, chattering about the birds she'd seen or the flowers she'd picked. These glimpses into Roman's pain helped Vivian understand his years of isolation. Unlike her own loss, which had come with the natural order of things, an older husband preceding, his wife to the grave, Roman's grief carried the terrible weight of lives cut short too soon. The community's reaction to Roman's regular presence proved mixed. Some neighbors, particularly the women at church, viewed his visits with curiosity and varying degrees of approval. Mary Caldwell expressed delight that Vivian had found such helpful company, while others whispered among themselves about the propriety of a widow woman entertaining a strange man so regularly. The criticism reached Vivian's ears through well-meaning friends who thought she should know what was being said. Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife who'd appointed herself guardian of community morals, had wondered aloud whether such an arrangement was appropriate for a woman of Vivian's standing. When Roman arrived the following Friday, Vivian found herself more reserved than usual, second-guessing every gesture of hospitality. He noticed the change immediately, setting down his coffee cup with careful precision. "Something's troubling you," he observed. "If I've done anything to cause offense, it's not you," she said quickly. "Some people in town are talking about your visits. They think it's inappropriate." Roman's jaw tightened, and she saw a flash of the steel that must have served him well as a soldier. "What exactly do they think is inappropriate about helping a neighbor with necessary repairs? You know how people talk. A widow woman, a man staying overnight sometimes." "I sleep in the barn," he said flatly. "I've never set foot in your house after dark, except to help you carry dishes to the kitchen. I've never touched you except to shake your hand in greeting." The hurt in his voice made her chest tighten. "I know that. And I know you're an honorable man. But some people see what they want to see." Roman stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he stared out at the mountains that had sheltered him for so many years. When he turned back to face her, his expression was resigned but determined. "I won't be the cause of gossip that damages your reputation," he said. If my visits are causing you trouble—" No, the word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "These are my choices to make, not theirs. If I want to invite a friend to dinner and accept help with my property, that's my business. Are you sure? I can find other places to winter, other work to do. I don't want you to suffer for my sake." Vivian looked at this man, who'd brought such unexpected light into her carefully ordered days. The thought of returning to her previous solitude, of eating meals alone and struggling with repairs she couldn't manage, felt suddenly unbearable. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Let them talk. I've lived too long and worked too hard to let other people's narrow minds dictate how I spend my time." Roman's smile returned, warm and grateful. "Then I'll keep coming if you'll have me." "I'll have you," she said. Then added with a hint of defiance that surprised them both, "And anyone who doesn't like it can discuss their concerns with me directly." That evening, as Roman prepared to settle in the barn for another night, Vivian stood at her kitchen window watching him tend to his mule. For the first time since David's death, she felt truly defiant, truly alive. The realization both thrilled and frightened her. She was changing, becoming someone who stood up for her choices rather than simply accepting what others thought proper. The woman at the window bore little resemblance to the careful widow who'd first offered water to a stranger just a few months ago. Roman looked up from his work and caught her watching. He raised his hand in a small wave, and she waved back without thinking twice about who might see or what they might make of such a simple gesture. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight she was exactly where she chose to be, with exactly the person she chose to have in her life. As she turned away from the window to prepare for bed, Vivian realized she was humming, actually humming, for the first time in 3 years. September brought crisp mornings and the first hints of autumn color in the aspen groves. Roman's visits had evolved beyond simple repairs into something more like partnership. He arrived earlier and stayed later, their conversations stretching into the evening hours as they sat on Vivian's front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes he stayed overnight in the barn. Sometimes he returned to whatever camp he'd made in the hills. But his presence had become as regular as the changing seasons. On a morning when frost silvered the grass and made their breath visible in small puffs, Roman appeared at Vivian's door, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, late-blooming asters and goldenrod that he'd gathered from the high meadows where he spent his solitary days. The pressed wildflower gift was simple but thoughtful, the kind of gesture that spoke of attention to small beauties and a desire to share them. "Thought these might brighten your kitchen table," he said, offering the flowers with the shy hesitancy of a schoolboy. "They're the last of the season. Snow'll get them soon enough." Vivian accepted the bouquet with hands that trembled slightly, touched by the unexpected tenderness of the gift. "They're beautiful. I haven't had flowers in the house since, well, in a long time." She arranged them in a mason jar filled with water, placing them where the morning light would catch their colors. Such a simple thing, but it transformed the familiar space, adding life and color to corners that had grown too accustomed to their own emptiness. The daily rhythm of their friendship had settled into comfortable patterns. Mornings began with coffee shared at the kitchen table while they planned the day's work. Roman had taken on increasingly complex projects around the homestead, reinforcing the barn roof, winterizing the chicken coop, splitting and stacking enough firewood to see her through the coldest months. In return, Vivian prepared meals that showcased her finest skills, taking genuine pleasure in watching him savor food prepared with care and attention. Their conversations had moved beyond the polite boundaries of acquaintanceship into something deeper and more intimate. Roman spoke more freely about his war experiences, the battles that had shaped him, the friends he'd lost, the skills he'd acquired that served him well in civilian life but carried their own weight of memory. "Some folks think the war was all glory and heroics," he said one afternoon, carefully fitting new shingles to repair storm damage on the cabin roof. "Truth is, most of it was just young men trying not to die while doing their duty. The heroics came later, in the telling." Vivian handed him another shingle, appreciating his honesty about experiences she'd only heard described in sanitized newspaper accounts. David never talked much about his time in service. Said some things were better left buried, smart man. But sometimes the buried things don't stay put. They work their way to the surface whether you want them to or not. She understood he was talking about more than just war memories, the guilt that followed survivors, the weight of making a new life when others hadn't been given that chance. His years in the mountains began to make more sense as a form of penance, a way of carrying his ghosts where they couldn't hurt anyone else. The domestic intimacies that developed between them felt both natural and revolutionary. Roman learned where she kept her good china, which cupboard held the coffee, how she liked her eggs prepared. Vivian found herself anticipating his preferences, the way he took his coffee black but appreciated cream for his oatmeal, how he favored cornbread over wheat, his fondness for the wild honey that her neighbors' bees produced. These small accommodations felt more significant than they should have. When she set the table for two, when she made sure there were enough biscuits for his hearty appetite, when she found herself humming while she cooked, these were the actions of a woman who had rediscovered purpose in caring for another person. The first serious storm of autumn caught them unprepared. What began as gentle rain in the morning had turned into a driving downpour by afternoon, with winds strong enough to rattle the windows and send the chickens huddling in their coop for safety. Roman had been working on repairs to the barn when the weather turned violent, and by evening it was clear he wouldn't be making the trek back to his mountain camp. Storms too fierce to travel in, Vivian said, peering out at the sheets of rain illuminated by lightning. You'll have to wait it out here. But the barn, she realized, would be cold and damp in this weather, no fit shelter for a man who'd been working hard all day. The practical part of her mind warred with the voice of propriety that had guided her decisions for 73 years. The barn's going to be miserable in this weather, she said finally. You can sleep on the sitting room sofa. It's warm in there and dry. Roman looked uncertain, clearly torn between gratitude and concern for her reputation. As are you sure? People already talk. Let them talk themselves hoarse, she replied with more confidence than she felt. I'm not sending a decent man out into a storm to preserve the opinion of gossips. That evening, as rain lashed the windows and wind howled around the eaves, they sat by the fire in her sitting room, sharing a companionable silence, broken occasionally by soft conversation. Roman occupied David's old chair with respectful ease, while Vivian worked on mending in her accustomed spot on the sofa. The scene felt both foreign and familiar, like stepping into a life that might have been. This is nice, Roman said quietly, gesturing toward the comfortable room. The warm fire, the sense of shelter and security. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that truly feels like home. Have you? She asked, looking up from her needlework. Forgotten. He considered the question seriously, his eyes reflecting the firelight. The physical comforts, yes. But more than that, the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something bigger than your own survival. Is that what this feels like to you? Belonging? The question hung between them, charged with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. Roman met her eyes across the small distance that separated them, and for a moment the careful boundaries they'd maintained seemed as fragile as spun glass. Yes, he said simply. It does. Vivian felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of truth that both thrilled and terrified her. This was no longer just friendship, no longer just the companionship of two lonely people who'd found comfort in each other's company. This was something deeper, more complicated, more dangerous to the careful equilibrium she'd maintained since David's death. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm afraid. Of what? Of this. Of whatever this is becoming. Roman leaned forward in his chair, his expression gentle but serious. We don't have to name it, Vivian. We don't have to decide what it means or where it leads. We can just let it be what it is. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, they both understood that some things couldn't be held in suspension forever. Eventually, they would have to choose. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything like delicate lacework. Vivian woke to the unfamiliar sound of someone moving quietly in her kitchen, and for a moment, the disorientation was complete. She'd grown so accustomed to solitude that another person's presence felt like stepping into someone else's life. She found Roman at her stove, carefully tending a pot of coffee and what smelled like bacon. He'd already been outside to tend the animals and gather eggs, she realized. Noting the basket on the counter and his damp boots by the door. "Didn't want to wake you," he said, looking almost embarrassed to be caught in her kitchen. "Thought I'd make myself useful. You don't need to," she began, then stopped. The truth was, waking to find breakfast already underway, to discover that someone had anticipated her needs and acted on them, felt like a luxury she'd forgotten existed. "Thank you," she said instead. "That's very thoughtful." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and revealing a world washed clean by the previous night's rain. The comfortable domesticity of the morning felt both natural and revolutionary, as if they'd crossed some invisible threshold during the storm. But as the days shortened and autumn deepened, Vivian found herself wrestling with emotions she'd thought were buried with David. Her worn Bible, the one that had guided her through every major decision of her adult life, became both comfort and source of confusion. The scriptures she'd always turned to for guidance seemed to offer conflicting messages about duty, faithfulness, and the possibility of second chances. She sat with the Bible open in her lap one evening, struggling with verses about widowhood and remarriage that had never seemed relevant to her circumstances. The book fell open to familiar passages about love and commitment, but now they raised questions rather than provided answers. Was she betraying David's memory by caring for another man? Was there an age limit on the heart's capacity for renewal? Mary Caldwell found her in this state of spiritual confusion when she stopped by with her youngest child, a toddler who developed a persistent cough. "You look troubled, Vivian," Mary observed, settling the child on her lap while Vivian prepared a steam treatment with herbs from her garden. "Is everything all right? I've been thinking about faithfulness," Vivian replied carefully. "What it means, how long it lasts." Mary's eyes softened with understanding. "This is about Mr. Fletcher, isn't it?" Vivian nodded, grateful to have someone to confide in. "I feel like I'm betraying David by caring for another man, but I also feel like I'm betraying myself by denying what's in my heart. Did David ever say he wanted you to spend the rest of your life alone?" "Of course not. He used to joke that I'd probably outlive him by 20 years and would need someone to keep me out of trouble. Then maybe the betrayal would be in refusing to live fully while you still can." Mary adjusted her child's position as the steam began to ease his breathing. "David loved you. Wouldn't he want you to be happy?" The conversation stayed with Vivian long after Mary left. That evening she found Roman in the barn, methodically grooming his mule by lantern light. The simple, meditative task seemed to calm him, and she wondered if he was wrestling with similar questions about loyalty and moving forward. "Roman," she said, settling on a nearby hay bale, "can I ask you something personal?" He paused in his brushing, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Do you ever feel guilty about being happy again after losing Sarah and Annie?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding. Roman set down the brush and leaned against his mule's flank, considering his answer. "Every day," he said finally. "Sometimes I'll catch myself laughing at something you've said, or looking forward to dinner, and I'll think, how can you be enjoying yourself when they're gone? How do you reconcile it? I think about what Sarah would say if she could see me now. She'd probably box my ears for wasting 3 years hiding in the mountains when I could have been living." He smiled sadly. "Sarah believed life was meant to be lived, not endured. She'd be furious with me for taking so long to figure that out. But doesn't it feel like forgetting them?" "No," Roman said firmly. "Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. Hearts aren't like pies. Vivian, taking a piece for someone new doesn't leave less for the people who came before. The casual way he said, "loving you," sent a shock through her system. It was the first time either of them had used that word, and it settled between them like a stone, dropped in still water. "Roman, I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated. I know we're too old for this kind of foolishness. But I can't help how I feel, and I won't apologize for it." That night, Vivian lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she'd shared with David for over 40 years. The familiar space felt different now, charged with possibilities she'd never imagined. She found herself remembering not just David's death, but his life, the way he'd laughed, the way he'd encouraged her dreams, the way he'd insisted that age was just a number, and the heart knew no. Calendar. The next morning brought news that would test every resolution she'd made about following her heart regardless of others' opinions. Mrs. Holloway arrived with several other church ladies, their faces set in expressions of determined concern. "Vivian, dear," Mrs. Holloway began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "we've come as friends, out of genuine worry for your reputation and well-being." "My well-being is just fine," Vivian replied, but she invited them in, understanding that this confrontation had been inevitable. "We're concerned about your association with this Fletcher person," another woman added. "It's simply not appropriate for a woman of your standing to be entertaining strange men in your home." "He's not strange, and I'm not entertaining him. He's a friend who helps with necessary work around the property. A friend who spends the night in your barn," Mrs. Holloway observed pointedly. "People are beginning to question your judgment, dear. Some are even suggesting that grief has affected your ability to make proper decisions." The implication struck Vivian like a physical blow. They weren't just questioning her morality, they were questioning her mental competence, her right to make her own choices. "I think," she said, her voice deadly calm, "that you should leave my property now." "Vivian, we're only trying to help." "Help?" Vivian stood, her hands trembling with anger. "You're trying to shame me into living my life according to your narrow rules. Well, I won't do it. I've earned the right to make my own choices, and I'll thank you to respect that." As the women left, muttering among themselves about stubbornness and poor judgment, Vivian realized she'd just declared war on the very community that had sustained her for decades. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt oddly liberated. The stranger who rode into Vivian's yard on a crisp October morning bore such a strong resemblance to Roman that she knew immediately who he must be. Younger, perhaps 35, with the same pale blue eyes and strong jaw. But where Roman carried himself with quiet humility, this man radiated confidence and barely contained irritation. He dismounted with sharp, efficient movements and approached the cabin with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat with perfunctory politeness, "I'm looking for Roman Fletcher. I have reason to believe he's been staying on your property." Before Vivian could respond, Roman emerged from behind the cabin where he'd been splitting firewood. The axe handle slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground as he stared at the younger man with an expression of shock and something that looked like fear. "Marcus," Roman said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for my father," Marcus Fletcher replied, his tone cold as mountain stone. "You're a hard man to find when you don't want to be found." The word father hit Vivian like a physical blow. In all their conversations, Roman had never mentioned having a living son. She'd assumed, based on his stories of loss and isolation, that his entire family had perished. The revelation recontextualized everything. His years in the mountains, his reluctance to speak of his past, the careful way he'd built his new life. "How did you find me?" Roman asked, making no move to embrace his son or welcome him. "Hired men to track you. Took them 6 months, but they found your trail eventually." Marcus glanced around the homestead with obvious disdain. "This is what you've been doing with yourself? Playing house with some old woman while your responsibilities go unmet?" The casual cruelty of the words made Vivian flinch, but Roman's reaction was swift and fierce. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. You'll speak respectfully of Mrs. Porter, or you'll leave this property immediately." "Respectfully?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Father, look at yourself. Look at what you've become. The great war hero, the Medal of Honor recipient, reduced to doing yard work for—" "Stop!" Roman's voice carried a note of command that suggested military training. "Vivian, would you mind giving us some privacy? This is a family matter." She wanted to stay, to defend him against whatever accusations his son was preparing to make, but she could see the shame in Roman's eyes, the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. Whatever was happening here, he wasn't ready to share it with her. "I'll be in the house," she said quietly, but she didn't go far. From her kitchen window, she could see the two men facing each other in the yard, their body language tense with years of unresolved conflict. Marcus pulled something from his saddlebags, a wooden box about the size of a book. Even from a distance, Vivian could see Roman's reaction to whatever it contained. His shoulders sagged, as if under a physical weight, and for a moment he looked older than his years. She couldn't hear their exact words, but the tone of the conversation was clear enough. Marcus spoke with the aggressive certainty of someone delivering an ultimatum, while Roman responded with increasing defensiveness. Their voices rose and fell like storm winds, carrying fragments of phrases that made her heart ache. Duty, family honor, responsibility, disgraceful. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour. Finally, Marcus returned to his horse, but not before delivering what appeared to be a final, devastating blow. Vivian saw Roman stagger as if he'd been physically struck, then watch helplessly as his son mounted and rode away without a backward glance. When Roman didn't immediately come to the house, Vivian went to find him. She discovered him sitting on the front steps, the wooden box open in his lap, staring at its contents with an expression of profound defeat. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, she realized, its bronze star and ribbon still bright despite the years. "You're a war hero," she said softly. Settling beside him on the steps he corrected. "A long time ago." "What happened, Roman? Why didn't you tell me you had a son?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with years of guilt and regret. Marcus was 15 when his mother and sister died, old enough to understand loss, young enough to need someone to blame. "I was the logical target. I'd survived when they didn't. I was the one who made the decision to bring them west, away from family and good medical care. You couldn't have known, couldn't I? I was so determined to use my military pension and land grants to build something grand, something worthy of the medal they gave me. I dragged them to a place where help was days away, instead of hours." His hands trembled as he touched the medal. "Marcus blamed me for their deaths, and he wasn't wrong. What did he want today? For me to come home, to accept the position the government's been offering me, training new recruits, sharing my expertise with the next generation of soldiers." Roman's laugh was bitter. "He says I'm disgracing the family name by living like a hermit, that I owe it to his mother's memory to make something of the recognition they gave me. And what do you think? I think I'm tired of being haunted by things I can't change. But Marcus sees my being here with you as the final betrayal of everything his mother represented." The pieces began falling into place. Roman's years of isolation, his reluctance to speak of family, the careful way he'd approached their relationship. He'd been hiding not just from the world, but from his own son's expectations and judgment. "He called me an old woman," Vivian said quietly. Roman turned to look at her, his eyes bright with anger. "He's young and stupid and hurting. It doesn't excuse his rudeness, but he's not entirely wrong, is he? I am old, we both are. Too old for this kind of complication, too old to be starting over." "Don't!" Roman said fiercely. "Don't let his poison into your head. Age doesn't disqualify us from happiness, Vivian. It doesn't make what we feel for each other less real or less valuable. But the damage was done." Vivian could feel the doubt creeping in, the voice that whispered she was being foolish, that she was clinging to something inappropriate for a woman of her years. Marcus had articulated fears she'd been trying to suppress. given voice to the criticism she'd been hearing in church circles for weeks. "Maybe he's right," she said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "Maybe I've been selfish, keeping you here when you have obligations elsewhere. Family responsibilities. Vivian, you should go with him, Roman. Make peace with your son. Accept the position they're offering. It's what a man of your standing should do. What about what I want?" "What we want." She couldn't look at him, knowing that meeting his eyes would destroy her resolve. "What we want doesn't matter. We're too old to put our desires ahead of duty and propriety." Roman stood slowly, the medal box clutched in his hands like evidence of crimes long past. "Is that really what you believe?" "It's what I have to believe," she whispered. That evening, Roman loaded his few possessions onto his pack mule with the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to every task. Vivian watched from her kitchen window, her heart breaking with each item he secured to his saddle. When he came to the door to say goodbye, she could barely meet his eyes. "This doesn't have to be the end," he said. "I can refuse the appointment, tell Marcus to build his own life instead of trying to manage mine." "No," she said firmly. "You have a son who needs you, responsibilities you've been avoiding. I won't be the reason you continue to run from them." Roman reached out as if to touch her face, then let his hand fall to his side. "I love you, Vivian Porter. That doesn't change just because my son disapproves, or because some people think we're too old for such feelings." "Love isn't always enough," she replied, though the words felt like swallowing glass. As she watched him ride away in the gathering dusk, following the same trail his son had taken that morning, Vivian understood that she'd just made the most selfless and most devastating decision of her life. The first week after Roman's departure crawled by with the agonizing slowness of a chronic illness. Vivian moved through her familiar routines like a woman walking underwater, each simple task requiring enormous effort. She made coffee for one, set the table for one, prepared meals that tasted like sawdust in her mouth. The silence that had once been her companion now felt like an adversary, pressing against her eardrums until she found herself speaking aloud to the chickens just to hear a human voice, the unfinished quilt that had been gathering dust in her bedroom chest, became her evening companion. She'd started the project during her first winter of widowhood, thinking to occupy her hands and mind during the long, dark hours. The pattern was double wedding ring, an ambitious design that required precision and patience. She'd abandoned it after completing only a few blocks, the symbolism too painful when her own wedding ring felt so heavy on her finger. Now she spread the pieces across her kitchen table, studying the intricate interlocking circles that would, when completed, represent the eternal nature of love and commitment. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she sat, alone again, working on a quilt that celebrated the very thing she'd just convinced herself she was too old to deserve. Each evening, she added a few more stitches, her fingers working automatically while her mind wrestled with the decision she'd made. Had she been wise to send Roman away, or had she simply taken the coward's path? The distinction seemed to blur more each day, like looking into water disturbed by wind. Mary Caldwell found her in this state when she arrived with a basket of late apples and what was clearly a mission of mercy. "You look terrible," Mary said with the bluntness of true friendship, settling at the kitchen table without invitation. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Vivian couldn't remember. The past week had been sustained by coffee and the occasional slice of bread, food consumed only when her body demanded fuel. "I've been eating fine. Don't lie to me, Vivian Porter. I've known you too long." Mary's eyes found the quilt pieces spread across the table. "This is beautiful work. I didn't know you were quilting again. Seemed like a good time to finish old projects. Is that what this is about? Finishing things? Or are you punishing yourself for being happy?" The question hit too close to the mark. Vivian's hands stilled on the fabric, and she found herself blinking back tears she'd been holding at bay for days. "I did the right thing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Roman has responsibilities, family obligations. I couldn't let him sacrifice that for—" She gestured vaguely at herself. "For this, for love." Mary's tone was gentle but implacable. For companionship? For the chance at happiness that most people would give anything to find. We're too old for such foolishness. According to who? His bitter son. Those gossipy church ladies who've probably never had an adventurous thought in their lives? Mary leaned forward, her expression intense. Vivian, I watched you with Roman. I saw the way you came alive when he was around. You were happier these past months than you've been since David died. That doesn't make it right. What makes it wrong? Your age, his obligations? Or are you just scared? The accusation stung because it carried the ring of truth. Fear had always been Vivian's enemy. Fear of taking chances, fear of what others might think, fear of being hurt again. She'd conquered those fears once, as a young woman leaving Ohio to marry a virtual stranger and build a life in untamed territory. But somewhere along the way, she'd let fear regain its hold on her heart. 2 days later, unexpected validation of her sacrifice arrived in the form of Joshua Whitehawk, a young crow, brave, who sometimes carried messages between the scattered settlements. He brought news that Roman had accepted the military appointment and would be relocating to Fort Laramie to train new recruits. The position came with substantial pay, military housing, and the respect due a decorated war hero. The Fletcher man asked me to tell you he's found his purpose again, Joshua reported, accepting the meal Vivian offered despite her heavy heart. Said to thank you for helping him remember his duty. The words should have brought comfort, confirmation that she'd made the right choice. Instead, they felt like nails in a coffin she'd built for her own happiness. Roman was moving on, accepting the life his son had mapped out for him, making the best of the sacrifice she'd forced on both of them. But as the days passed, other voices began to make themselves heard. The community's reaction to Roman's departure proved more complex than she'd anticipated. Several neighbors, including some who'd been critical of their relationship, stopped by to express surprise and even disappointment that such a decent man had moved on. He was good for you, observed Mrs. Patterson, the widow who lived nearest to town. Haven't seen you look so well in years. Seemed like a shame, him leaving so sudden-like. Even more surprising was a visit from Thomas Brightwater, the settlement's unofficial leader, and a man whose opinion carried weight throughout the valley. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, declining her offer of refreshment, but accepting her invitation to sit on the front porch. Heard Fletcher's gone east, he said without preamble. Military appointment from what I understand. That's right. A good opportunity for a man of his experience. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, studying the mountains where Roman had spent so many solitary years. Funny thing, though. Had a chance to talk with some folks who knew him during the war. Seems he was quite the hero, saved an entire company of men when their position was overrun. Lost a lot of good soldiers that day, but Roman Fletcher made sure more didn't die needlessly. Vivian waited, sensing there was more to this story. Man like that carries weight, Thomas continued. The kind of weight that can crush you if you don't find a way to bear it properly. Some folks turn to drink, some to violence. Fletcher chose isolation. Not uncommon among veterans who've seen too much. He mentioned the guilt he carried. I imagine he did. What interests me is what changed for him recently. Word is, he'd been living rough in the high country for 3 years, barely speaking to another soul. Then suddenly he's down here working steady, talking about settling somewhere permanent. Takes something powerful to pull a man out of that kind of darkness. Thomas turned to look at her directly, his weathered face kind but serious. Whatever healing happened here, it was good for him. Good for you, too, from what I observed. Seems a shame to let other people's small-mindedness break up something that was helping 2 decent folks find their way back to living. The conversation haunted Vivian long after Thomas left. She'd assumed the community's disapproval was universal, but apparently the reality was more nuanced. Some people had seen what she and Roman were building together and recognized its value, even if they hadn't spoken up at the time. That evening, she received another unexpected visitor. Marcus Fletcher stood at her door, his hat in his hands and his expression far different from the arrogant hostility he'd displayed during his first visit. This time he looked uncertain, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Porter," he said, his voice strained. "Might I have a word with you?" She invited him in, though warily. Whatever had brought him back, it was clearly something significant enough to overcome his obvious distaste for her and her circumstances. "I owe you an apology," he began, settling uncomfortably in her sitting room. "My behavior during my last visit was inexcusable. I was angry and said things that were cruel and untrue. You were protecting your father's interests as you saw them, was I? Or was I trying to control his life because I couldn't control my own grief?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded her painfully of Roman. "I've spent so many years blaming him for my mother's death, for our family's dissolution, that I forgot he lost them too. Maybe more than I did, in some ways." Vivian waited, letting him find his own way to whatever revelation had brought him here. "He's been at Fort Laramie for 2 weeks now," Marcus continued, "doing his job, training recruits, being everything the army wants a war hero to be. But he's not happy. Mrs. Porter, he goes through the motions, says the right words, but there's no life in him. That may change, given time. No, it won't, because he's in love with you, and I made him choose between that love and my approval." "What kind of son does that make me?" The raw pain in his voice made her chest tighten. "A grieving one. A frightened one. A young man who's trying to make sense of losses that don't make sense." Marcus looked up at her, and she saw Roman's eyes in his face, the same intelligence, the same capacity for deep feeling. "He's not coming back, is he? Even if I told him I was wrong, even if I begged him to return to you, he won't abandon his duty twice." "No," Vivian said quietly. "He won't." They sat in silence for a moment, two people who loved the same man and had conspired in different ways to drive him away from the happiness he'd found. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "Then someone else is going to have to go to him." The letter took Vivian 3 attempts to write. Her first effort had been too formal, full of careful phrases that said nothing about the ache in her chest or the way the sunrise looked different without Roman there to share it. The second attempt swung too far in the opposite direction. Raw emotion spilled across the page like blood from a wound. Desperate and undignified, the final version, written by lamplight as November wind rattled her windows, was simple and honest. "Roman, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding hearts and pies. How loving someone new doesn't diminish what came before. You were right, and I was wrong to let fear convince me otherwise. Marcus visited me last week. He's changed, I think. Grief has a way of either breaking people or teaching them wisdom, and he seems to have chosen the latter path. He told me you're not happy at Fort Laramie. That duty without joy is just another form of prison. I'm an old woman, Roman, but I'm not a foolish one. At least I'm trying not to be. I know what I said about age and propriety, about being too old for love. But lying here at night in this quiet house, I realize I was letting other people's small minds dictate the size of my heart. If you can forgive me for sending you away, if you can forgive me for being scared when I should have been brave, then I have something to ask you. Not as a desperate woman clinging to faded dreams, but as someone who has learned the difference between surviving and living. Will you come home? Oh, my love, Vivian." She sealed the letter with trembling fingers and gave it to Joshua Whitehawk when he passed through on his regular circuit. The 2 weeks that followed felt like a lifetime compressed into days. Every sound of approaching horses sending her heart racing. Every sunset without his return confirming her worst fears. Maybe the letter had never reached him. Maybe Fort Laramie was too far, the military obligations too binding. Maybe Roman had decided that her rejection, however well-intentioned, had killed whatever feelings he'd harbored for her. Maybe Marcus had been wrong about his father's unhappiness. Perhaps Roman had found contentment in his new role, purpose in training young soldiers, peace in meeting expectations instead of following his heart. The uncertainty was agony, but it was also clarifying. During those long days of waiting, Vivian discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She continued her daily routines, but now they felt like preparation rather than mere survival. She finished the double wedding ring quilt, her stitches growing more confident with each completed block. She organized her recipe collection, preserving decades of culinary wisdom for whoever might need it. She wrote letters to distant family members, re-establishing connections that grief had allowed to wither. Most importantly, she spent time with herself, really with herself, for perhaps the first time since David's death. Not the grieving widow, not the dutiful neighbor, not the woman trying to live up to others' expectations, but simply Vivian Porter, 73 years old and still capable of growth, change, and hope. The revelation came gradually. She didn't need Roman to validate her choice to live fully. His return would be a gift, a blessing she would treasure, but his absence wouldn't diminish her worth or her right to happiness. She had value beyond her usefulness to others, desires that deserved respect regardless of her age, dreams that remained valid even if others found them inappropriate. This newfound confidence was tested when Mrs. Holloway and her delegation of concerned ladies returned, clearly emboldened by Roman's departure and what they saw as vindication of their position. "We heard you've been writing letters to that Fletcher man," Mrs. Holloway announced, settling uninvited in Vivian's sitting room like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Vivian, dear, surely you can see how undignified this appears. A woman of your age, chasing after a man who's clearly moved on." "Stop right there," Vivian interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her. "You're in my home, uninvited and unwelcome, presuming to dictate how I should conduct my private affairs. That ends now. We're only trying to help." "No, you're trying to control. There's a difference." Vivian stood, moving to the front door and opening it wide. "I'm 73 years old. I've buried a husband, survived 3 harsh winters alone, and built a life that serves both my community and myself. If I choose to write letters to a man I care about, that's my decision to make. But surely you can see how inappropriate what I see," Vivian said firmly, "is a group of women so afraid of their own unfulfilled desires that they need to police everyone else's happiness. What I see is people who think age disqualifies a person from love, companionship, or joy. What I see is small minds trying to make the whole world as narrow as their own experience." The ladies exchanged shocked glances, and clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation. "I've made my choice," Vivian continued. "I choose to live fully while I can, to love deeply while I'm able, and to face whatever consequences come with courage rather than regret. If that troubles you, I suggest you examine why other people's happiness threatens you so deeply." As the women left in scandalized silence, Vivian realized she'd just burned the last bridge to her old, carefully circumscribed life. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like liberation. Roman returned on a Tuesday morning in early December, when the first snow of winter was beginning to dust the peaks, and the air carried the sharp promise of harder weather to come. Vivian was feeding her chickens when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats, but this time she didn't allow herself to hope. Too many false alarms had taught her to guard her heart against disappointment, but when she looked up from scattering feed, there he was, older somehow, wearier, but unmistakably Roman Fletcher, sitting astride his horse with his pack mule trailing behind. In his weathered hands, he held something small and glinting in the morning sunlight. "Vivian," he said, dismounting slowly, as if his bones had stiffened during the long ride from Fort Laramie. "I got your letter." She set down the feed bucket with trembling hands, suddenly aware of her appearance, hair escaping from its braid, work dress stained with chicken droppings. No attempt at the dignity she'd imagined for this moment. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure I should." He approached slowly, respectfully, as he had during their first meeting. "I resigned my commission. Told them I'd served my country long enough, and it was time to serve my heart." "What did Marcus say?" Roman's smile was rueful but genuine. "He said it was about time I stopped letting other people's expectations run my life. Turns out my son has grown wiser during these past months. We both have, I think," He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the hope and uncertainty warring in his pale eyes. "Vivian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you inviting me back because you love me, or because you're lonely? Because if it's loneliness, I can help with that as a friend. But if it's love—" He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "If it's love, then I have something for you." He opened his hand, revealing a simple gold ring, not ornate or expensive, but clearly well-made and carefully chosen. "This was my wife's wedding ring. I've carried it with me for 10 years, not sure what to do with it, not ready to let it go. But lately I've been thinking Sarah would want it to symbolize new beginnings rather than endings." Vivian stared at the ring, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he must hear it. "Roman, I'm not asking you to marry me," he said quickly. "Not yet, anyway. I'm asking if you'll accept this as a promise that love doesn't have an expiration date, that two people who found each other in the winter of their lives deserve the same happiness as those who meet in spring." What kind of promise? The promise that will face whatever comes together. The promise that I won't run away again when things get difficult or when people disapprove. The promise that will build something real and lasting, whatever form that takes. Vivian looked into his eyes and saw not just love, but understanding, the recognition of two souls who'd traveled similar paths of loss and healing. "The community will talk, let them talk. We'll give them something worth discussing. My son has learned that love given freely enriches everyone it touches. He wants me to be happy, Vivian. And you make me happier than I thought possible at this stage of life." She extended her hand, and Roman slipped the ring onto her finger with the reverence of a man performing a sacred ritual. It fit perfectly, as if Sarah Fletcher had somehow known that her ring would one day symbolize not competition with her memory, but continuation of the love she'd begun. "I love you, Roman Fletcher," Vivian said, the words coming easily now that fear no longer trapped them in her throat. "I love your gentleness and your strength, your stories and your silences, your willingness to work with your hands and your courage in facing painful truths. And I love you, Vivian Porter. I love your independence and your generosity, your cooking and your conversation, your fierce defense of the people you care about, and your willingness to risk everything for happiness." They came together then, not with the desperate passion of young lovers, but with the deep gratitude of people who'd learned that love is precious precisely because it's fragile, valuable because it's rare. Their kiss tasted of tears and promises, of second chances, and the wisdom that comes from understanding how quickly everything can change. When they broke apart, Roman rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" "Now we figure out how to build a life together. Not the life other people think we should have, not the life we had with others, but our life, the one we choose. And if people disapprove, then they disapprove. We're too old to waste time worrying about the opinions of people who've forgotten what it feels like to have their hearts stirred." Roman laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cold morning air. "Mrs. Porter, I believe you've become a revolutionary in your old age." "No," she corrected, admiring the way Sarah Fletcher's ring caught the winter sunlight. "I've just remembered who I was before the world convinced me to be smaller." 6 months later, on a morning when spring had painted the Montana Valley in shades of green Vivian had almost forgotten existed, she stood at her kitchen window watching Roman install the new garden gate he'd been working on for the past week. The gate was beautiful in its simplicity, sturdy pine posts supporting panels of his own design, with a wide opening that welcomed visitors rather than warning them away. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. The old gate had been functional but unwelcoming, designed by a woman who'd grown accustomed to solitude. This new one spoke of lives open to possibility, hearts ready to embrace whatever came next. "What do you think?" Roman called, testing the hinges one final time. At 54, with regular meals and the contentment of shared purpose, he looked younger than the weathered mountain man who'd first appeared at her door, seeking water and finding so much more. "Perfect," Vivian replied, and meant it. At 74, She discovered that perfect didn't require flawless. It simply required honest, authentic, and chosen with full hearts. The changes in their lives had come gradually but persistently, like spring thaw reshaping familiar landscapes. Roman had moved from the barn into David's old workshop, which they'd converted into comfortable living quarters. Not the main house. They weren't ready for that level of intimacy, and the arrangement satisfied both their need for companionship and their lifelong habits of independence. Their days had settled into rhythms that honored both their individual natures and their partnership. Mornings began with coffee shared at the kitchen table while they planned the day's work. Roman had proven invaluable in maintaining and improving the homestead. The barn roof was finally finished, the chicken coop reinforced against winter storms. The garden expanded to accommodate his ambitious plans for crop rotation. But the practical benefits, significant as they were, paled beside the emotional transformation both had experienced. Vivian found herself laughing again, really laughing, at Roman's dry observations about their neighbors or his stories of life in the high country. Roman discovered that contentment didn't require isolation, that sharing joy doubled it rather than diluting it. The community's reaction had evolved in ways neither expected. The initial scandal had given way to grudging acceptance, and in some cases, genuine appreciation. When Thomas Brightwater's wife fell ill with fever that lasted 3 weeks, Vivian and Roman had taken turns sitting with her, bringing meals and helping with household tasks. Their competence in crisis had earned respect that social disapproval couldn't diminish. Funny thing about people, Mary Caldwell had observed one Sunday after church. They criticize what they don't understand, but when they need help, they don't much care about the helper's personal arrangements. Even Mrs. Holloway had softened, though she maintained a frosty dignity whenever their paths crossed. The other church ladies had divided into camps, some maintaining their disapproval, others quietly envying a woman who'd had the courage to choose happiness over convention. Marcus Fletcher had visited twice, each time staying longer and speaking more freely. The angry young man who'd first confronted his father had grown into someone capable of admitting mistakes and learning from them. His last visit had brought news of his engagement to a school teacher from Denver, and he'd asked Roman to stand up with him at the wedding. Sarah would have liked her, Roman had told Vivian after Marcus left. She's got that same combination of strength and gentleness that drew me to his mother. And she'll be lucky to have you as a father-in-law, Vivian had replied. You and Marcus have both grown into the men your losses were trying to teach you to become. Their own relationship had continued to deepen without rushing toward any particular destination. They'd talked about marriage. Roman had proposed twice, and Vivian had gently declined both times. Not from lack of love, but from a desire to live authentically rather than meet others' expectations of what their commitment should look like. We're already committed, she'd explained. We share our days, our work, our meals, our hopes. A piece of paper won't make that more real, and the absence of one doesn't make it less valid. Roman had accepted her reasoning with the same grace he brought to everything else. What mattered wasn't the legal structure of their relationship, but the daily choice to build something together, to support each other through ordinary difficulties and extraordinary joys. The morning of the gate installation had brought unexpected visitors, a young couple traveling through the territory, looking for land to settle and advice from established homesteaders. They'd arrived tired, dusty, and clearly overwhelmed by the enormity of the task they'd set themselves. "Welcome," Vivian had called, opening the new gate wide and gesturing them toward the house. "You look like you could use a meal and some honest conversation about what it takes to build a life out here." Over dinner, she and Roman had shared the practical wisdom accumulated over decades of frontier living, which crops grew best in their climate, how to preserve meat through the summer heat, where to find the most reliable sources for tools and supplies. But they'd also shared something more valuable, the understanding that building a life required not just practical skills, But the courage to choose love over fear, community over isolation, hope over despair, you make it look easy, the young woman had said, watching Roman and Vivian work together to clear the table, their movements coordinated by months of shared domestic routine. Nothing about it was easy, Vivian had replied. But the hard things are often the most worthwhile, and having someone to share the difficulties makes them bearable, even meaningful. As evening settled over the valley and their guests prepared to continue their journey, Vivian stood beside Roman at the new gate, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The scene was achingly beautiful, but more than that, it felt complete in a way her solitary sunsets never had. "Any regrets?" Roman asked, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "But perhaps that's the point. We needed to become who we are before we could appreciate who we are together." In the gathering twilight, with their hearts full and their hands joined, they understood that love indeed keeps its own calendar, flowering whenever hearts are ready to receive it, regardless of what the world might say about proper seasons for such things.